Welcome. I'm Dr. Sylvia Peregrino. This is Entre Nosotras, Latina Voices. Today, my guest is Dr. Thomas Patterson from Harvard University. He's the Bradley Professor of Government and the Press. And so today we're here to talk about the midterm elections and what we see for the future for the next 2 years. So welcome, Dr. Patterson.
Well, thank you.
Dr. Patterson, tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I grew up in a small town of 1,000. It's now down to about 750 in the heartland, rural Minnesota. I grew up in a large family. There were 10 of us. We were a very close family. And then I went on to college. And after I went through ROTC when I was in college, and which meant when I graduated, I was also commissioned as a military officer. For a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army, spent part of my military commitment at Fort Bragg, and then a year in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. So then I went to grad school, earned my PhD in political science. From there, I went to Syracuse University, there for a couple of decades. Then I came to Harvard in the 1990s.
I believe you might have at some point visited Fort Bliss.
I made a pretty broad swing of Army bases, starting from Fort Bragg in North Carolina. I went to Jackson in South Carolina, down to Benning in Georgia, and then cut across to Polk in Louisiana, Fort Hood, Fort Bliss, then up into Oklahoma, Fort Sill, Kansas, Fort Riley, came back, Fort Campbell in Kentucky. So I pretty much did the whole loop. I wanted to say I'd set foot in Mexico, and I still have a wooden chess set that I picked up, and we played a game on that chessboard that I've carried around since the day that I went across the border there when I was temporarily stationed at Fort Bliss.
Well, thank you for your service, and nice to know that you have this connection to El Paso, if at all briefly. And Fort Bliss has actually gotten bigger since they realigned a lot of the bases, and it's a big deal here in our community. So at least you have that El Paso connection. And so thinking about these recent midterm elections, why do you think the Democrats did better than expected in these recent midterm elections?
Well, as you know, Sylvia, usually midterm elections are bad for the in party. Almost always the House party really, they don't always clean house, but they usually do quite well. And Republicans didn't do as well as the out party normally does. Now, it's not that they did really badly. They did take control of the House of Representatives. They had hoped to take control of the Senate. Going into the election, we had a 50-50 Senate. So if they could have picked up a single seat net, they would have been able to control the Senate. They didn't do that. In fact, the Democrats maintained control. We still have a runoff election coming in Georgia. It could even be a 51-49 Senate, which would be a Democratic pickup. But I think two reasons, I think, why Republicans underperformed relative to history. One was that ordinarily midterms are a referendum on the incumbent president. And in this case, it would be a referendum on Joe Biden. And Joe Biden had quite low approval ratings. That's usually bad for the in party. And the economy with high inflation, when the economy is weak, that's usually bad for the in party as well. So Biden was kind of hovering over this election and a deficit for the Democrats. But what was unusual is that another occupant of that office, the White House, was also very much prominent in this election, Donald Trump. And he sustained his presence politically by claiming that the 2020 election was stolen. So he kept that claim going all the way through the midterms. And he did something that former presidents rarely do, and that's to get deeply involved in partisan politics after they leave office. And as you know, he campaigned in a lot of states, endorsed quite a number of candidates, particularly a number of Senate candidates. And this was somewhat disruptive of the Republican Party, because what happened in those primary elections, you had a Trump-endorsed candidate, and then you had a more traditional, or more sometimes called an establishment Republican as the opponent. And that kind of in-party fighting usually doesn't help a party all that much. As it happened on the Senate side particularly, and even Mitch McConnell, the Republican Senate leader, said, we've got some pretty weak Senate candidates for our party. If you look at who they were all Trump-endorsed candidates, candidates who were on the right wing of the party, not the establishment wing of the party. That can work in a primary election, because in the primary, of course, it's the party voters who make the choice. And they chose people like Herschel Walker, for example, in Georgia, Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania. These turned out to be pretty weak contenders in what should have been kind of Republican states. Those should have been 2 Senate seats that Republicans normally would have been expected in a midterm to pick up. And so Donald Trump was on the ballot, like President Biden, is quite low favorability rating. So the Republicans had a drag on the ticket. And then another thing that came along that really changed the dynamic of the midterms in the Democrats' favor was the Supreme Court's abortion decision in late June. And up to that point, the enthusiasm gap, Republicans were much more excited about voting in the November election. And they actually maintained that. So they maintained a high enthusiasm level for a midterm election. But what that Supreme Court decision helped do was to energize the Democratic base. And so we had very high turnout on both the Democratic side and the Republican side. Back in the spring, it looked like Republicans would turn out in pretty substantial numbers, Democrats less so. But once you start getting both parties enthusiastic, and that helped offset this normal problem that the out party has in a midterm of getting its voters excited. They won the last presidential election. They're the incumbent party. Usually it's harder to get them motivated for the midterm. But this time, both Democrats and Republicans were highly motivated. That actually served the Democrats because normally that's an advantage for the out party.
The Republicans did win, but won by smaller margins than anticipated. And on the Senate side, we're still waiting to hear based on what happens next week in Georgia.
Right. So we've got to wait on the results of the Warnock-Walker race in Georgia. But so we're either going to have a 50-50 Senate, in which case the deciding vote there is cast by the vice president, who's the president of the Senate. And under our Constitution can only cast a vote when the vote is tied in the Senate. So Kamala Harris will, if it's 50-50, will break that tie in favor of the Democrats. So they'll be the Senate majority, or we'll have, if Warnock wins, there'll be a 51-49 Senate majority. And so it'll be an outright majority. There's an interesting feature of the House races, though, that hasn't received the attention that I think it deserves. Even though Republicans kind of narrowly took over control of the House, if you look at the House vote nationally, they should have done better. They should have actually picked up 20 or 30 seats and not basically flipped to roughly the 10 that they did. And the reason I say that is when you look at the national House vote, not district by district, Republicans won that vote 2 to 48%. And normally, if you get 52% of the House votes, you get a sizable majority of the House seats, but it didn't work out that way this time. And I think the analysts are still a little bit puzzled about that as to why that would be the case. Obviously, the redistricting that was just done after the 2020 census really did shake up the House districts. But I think the explanation lies in the fact that if you look over time at what's happening in our states, they become increasingly Republican or increasingly Democratic. And then, for example, my home state, not my original home state was Minnesota, but my home state now is Massachusetts. Massachusetts is a deep blue state. I mean, Democrats swept the board. Every statewide office and federal office in Massachusetts was won by a Democrat. So what happens in a state like Massachusetts with so many Democrats is that Democrats waste a lot of votes, right? They got more votes than they need to get their candidates elected to office. Well, when you look across the country, there are more deep red states that are really heavily Republican. And what that means is within those states, Republicans are wasting a lot of votes. They don't need these 60-40, 70-30 margins to win elections. They can win in 51-49, right? And but they were winning a lot of elections by a large margin. And I think that accounts for the fact that they actually defeated the Democrats quite handily in the national congressional vote, but didn't win the House seats commensurate with that showing.
Like you mentioned, this is historic because normally the president's party loses a lot more seats.
Yeah, and there have been a few exceptions to that, but if you look at the last century, there's only 3 times in the 25 midterm elections of the past century where the in-party has picked up seats. So, and in that sense, 2022 went according to form. The out-party picked up more House seats than the in-party, but then when you look at the historic averages as to how many seats normally the out-party picks up, it's a lot more than the Republicans picked up this time. So in that sense, historically at least, they underperformed, even though now obviously they control the House of Representatives.
I was frankly surprised. I thought it was going to go worse for the Democrats. But like you mentioned, maybe the Dobbs decision helped get more voters out for Biden's party. What do you think will be the signature accomplishments during his first 2 years for Biden?
I think if you look back, and if I were Biden, I would say I did pretty well with getting us through the last heated phase of the pandemic with the stimulus bill. I started to restart the economic engine with that very important roughly $250 billion to basically revitalize America's computer chip industry. 95% of the computer chips that are used in American production now come from overseas. And we've seen what happens when supply chains get disrupted, as they did during pandemic. A lot of factories, the production lines basically slowed down or shut down because they didn't have the chips they needed to produce the products. I would also point to the large infrastructure bill that was passed by the Congress of the United States. We've talked about for 15 years a big infrastructure bill coming out of the Congress of the United States. Trump talked about it every year of his presidency, didn't get it done. Biden talked about it frequently when he was, Obama talked about it frequently when he was president, didn't happen. Biden was able to get that passed. And then I think when we're going to look back on this, we're going to some degree, we're going to frame Biden a little bit in the model of Harry Truman when it comes to foreign policy. I think his response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to be able to pull together the Western alliance to the degree that it's come together, that kind of backing and unanimity almost. Now there's some outliers. Hungary hasn't kind of kicked in as the other NATO countries have, but they've been solidly behind Ukraine, giving them weaponry, humanitarian support, and the like. During the Trump presidency, NATO was fraying, and there were some worries about whether it might even might break up. But it's probably a tighter alliance now than at any time since early in the Cold War. That's a real achievement. And I think he wants to reset U.S. relations with China. He met recently at the G20 with President Xi. They met privately. I don't think either of them wants a Cold War, but they're in pretty strong competition for influence around the world. And Biden, with that computer chip legislation, for example, and other things that he's doing, he's pretty much signaled to China that we're in the game, we're going to compete. And yes, we'd like to have friendly relations with you, and this is going to be a competition that goes beyond economics and goes beyond advanced technology. This is going to be a competition over ways of governing as to, whether our system, democratic systems, which are very much bottom up. It's not simply about citizens being a large part of our governing system, but the degree to which we depend on the private sector. If you look at R&D in this country, where does the development? Why are we at the cutting edge in terms of technology? That's mostly from the private sector. Government has an important role there to provide seed money for these new technologies that are not yet profitable to get them started. But that's our model. And then you have China's model, where the Communist Party maintains pretty tight control over every aspect of society, including what people are going to be exposed to in terms of information. But if you look at China's response to how it's thinking about, leapfrogging the US in terms of technology, it's from the top down. It's government fully subsidizing artificial intelligence, trying to push forward on quantum computing and some of these other really advanced technologies. So these are different models. And I think what Biden is saying, game on. We think we have the better system, and we're going to compete with you. And it's going to be a peaceful competition, but it's going to be competition. We're not going to sit on the sidelines and simply cede influence in large parts of the world simply because you're trying to exert influence in those places.
And that's great. I didn't even think we were going to go into foreign policy. And I actually thought it was the beginning
I think it was your question that took me there. So.
Yeah, no, I thought it was the beginning of World War III when, when Russia started invading Ukraine. And so happy that he's been able to maintain, that fine line to not, I guess, get us into another conflict.
We don't know. I mean, Ukraine is having surprising success on the battlefield. And, we don't know how Putin will react if, in fact, it looks like Ukraine is going to push the Russians completely out of Ukraine. It could get uglier than it is, and it's very ugly right now.
I know there's concerns about that. And so thinking more about domestic policy, and you have a lot of experience as a political scientist. Do you think democracy is in danger, given the January 6th attacks on Congress, given, the attack on Speaker Pelosi's husband, like a attempted, kidnapping and perhaps, attempted murder of politicians? Is this as ugly as it's ever been, or was it worse in the 1960s?
I think in terms of attacks on democracy, this is certainly the worst it's been since the 1850s, the lead up to the Civil War, I'd extend it beyond that. I mean, the Jim Crow era. Now that was regional, not national, but that was a huge attack on democracy. The idea that you keep Black Americans from voting so that whites could maintain control and force Black children to go to separate schools from white children, Black citizens to use different hospitals, understaffed hospitals. Couldn't sit in the same places on public transportation. They went to a movie theater, had to sit in the balcony. They couldn't sit on the ground. I mean, look, that is an undemocratic stain on our democracy, and it lasted for a long period of time. So, it's hard to equate anything today or any other period with the way that, and pre-Civil War was slavery. I mean, you can't think of anything that's more anti-democratic than that or undemocratic than that. But I think since the 60s, I think this is no doubt, without any question, I think this is signs of our democracy fraying, I think are more robust now than at any recent time. I mean, so you get election deniers, people who refuse to accept the vote, people who want to pass laws and that make it harder for people to vote, and then violence as an instrument of politics. I mean, you start adding all of these things together, I think. And one point I would make, there's no guarantee that democracies last forever. If you look at the history of the world, we've seen democracies die. We're not heading in a very healthy direction at the moment. Now, I do take some heart in the fact that many election deniers who were on the ballot in the midterms lost. On the other hand, there are about 150 who won state or federal office. So, they're out there and, and without any evidence. And the claims made over and over again erode trust in our institutions. And, if you think about all the things that keep a democracy functioning properly, the laws matter, the institutions matter, but so do the sentiments of the people. Whether you have trust in your government, whether you're tolerant, we shouldn't be looking at people in the other party as enemies. They're rivals, they're opponents. We like to beat them in elections, but they're not a threat to this nation. But increasingly, that's the way that we talk about people in the other party. But I will say this about the 2022 midterms. It's a little healthier now than it was right before the midterms, because election denialists didn't fare all that well. And the other thing is, there were a lot of fears heading into the November election that we would be doing a rerun of the election was stolen kind of argument, and that would be a refrain that we would hear heavily in the aftermath of the midterms. But it's actually, we haven't seen a lot of that. We get a little bit, a few people are saying it was, taken away from them in Arizona or some other place. But by and large, there's been a pretty substantial acceptance of this election as free, fair, legitimate. That's a very different tone than we had after the 2020 election, at least within one party.
So happy to see that you're optimistic about the future. And so
cautiously optimistic.
Cautiously optimistic. And so with 2024 coming up and Trump already declaring his candidacy, do you think he'll be the Republican nominee in 2024, or do you think some people are distancing themselves from him? Some elected officials are.
Well, we're certainly seeing some distancing on the part of some elected officials, perhaps not as many as you might expect, but some. And some of the conservative media have moved away from Trump. He's getting less attention from Fox and less favorable attention on Fox. One of my indicators is the New York Post. Rupert Murdoch owns Fox News. He also owns the New York Post, and they were very supportive of Trump during his presidency and into the election. But sees 2022 as the third Trump defeat in a row. In some ways, he hasn't fared all that well in recent elections, and they had on the front page when he made his announcement for the presidency, they had a simple banner on the bottom of the page. You may have seen it. I think it was Florida man declares candidacy or something of that kind, right? So no face, no Florida man, right? So there's been an erosion of his support, but you still, I think one of the things we've always underestimated about Trump is that, he became the Republican presidential nominee, and but Make America Great Again also resembles a political movement in some ways, and so it works both within channels, election channels, but it also is working outside of those channels, and so he's got a core of support. So I think to more directly go to your question about whether he'll be the Republican nominee. First of all, there's a lot of stuff that can happen between now and 2024 that could upset any of the predictions. But I think it will depend. If it was today, I think it would depend on the field. If it's Trump and 5 or 6 others seeking the Republican nomination, you have to ask yourself which of those candidates has got the largest core support, and it would be Donald Trump. And the Democratic Party, in its rules for the presidential nominating system, has a proportional representation system. So if you go into New Hampshire and you win 24% of the vote, you're only going to get about 1/4 of the delegates. The Republicans have a winner-take-all option. So, Trump is polling at 35-40%, and his nearest competitor is down there at 25. He's going to reap a windfall in those winner-take-all states in terms of delegates. So I wouldn't count him out. Now, he's not as strong as he was a year ago. That's clear, but I wouldn't count him out.
Switching gears a little bit, because we're kind of coming to a close. I know from when I ran into you at the conference, you mentioned that you knew Ann Richards. And so maybe we'll end on an anecdote that you might have about meeting Governor Richards. I show a documentary to my students about her because they've only known the Republican Party within their lifetime.
I mean, she was a character. I mean, she was one of these larger than life politicians, and most politicians, when you meet them, are not larger than life. They're quite ordinary, but she was a Texan all the way through. I mean, so she loved to talk about the state and its values and its strengths and, it's the opportunities and the potential and what it can be. And I think politicians who I admire, I think maybe Bobby Kennedy said it best about, it's not the way things are, it's the way things can be or ought to be or should be. And she was very much of that mindset. It's the mindset of the optimist who believes that America and Americans and within their state, Texans, or whether they're from Massachusetts, Minnesotans, whatever, the only limitation on our capacity, on our future is ourselves. And we dig in, we go as hard as we can. The sky's the limit. I mean, that was Ann Richards.
I met Ann Richards once at a conference. It was a Women in Public Policy, but it was in the 90s. So I didn't have a cell phone camera. Cell phones didn't exist then. And so, but she did a lot to open up state government to women, to people of color. And so for that, I think she'll always be remembered. And so we've talked a lot about different topics. Is there anything you would like to add?
Well, so yeah, except what a delight it was to sit next to you in our conference in Dallas and think for 2 days about how we better instruct our students and and really come to help them to better understand government. And again, I think it goes to higher education, what you and I try to do in our classrooms, that is to really broaden people's thinking, getting them to kind of raise their view, expand their horizon, understand things they don't presently understand. And almost always that enriches your life, but also gives you a deeper appreciation of other people.
So Dr. Patterson, thank you for being a guest on Entre Nosotras, Latina Voices. We appreciate your time and your insight.
Sylvia, thank you so much for inviting me. And again, it was such a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, sir.